What happens when a perfect crime isn't so perfect after all? For decades, these killers walked free, believing their secrets were buried forever. They left behind a trail of grief, shattered families, and baffling cold cases that haunted detectives for generations. But they never counted on the one silent witness they couldn't outrun: their own DNA. Today, we're looking at 3 famous cold cases where science finally had the last word, unmasking monsters who were hiding in plain sight. For over a decade, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, an entire state was held hostage by a shadow. He went by many names: the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, but to his victims he was a terrifying phantom who slipped through their windows at night, a whisper in the dark who turned their homes into scenes of unimaginable horror. His reign of terror stretched across California, a brutal spree that included at least 13 murders, more than 50 horrific rapes, and over 120 burglaries. He was methodical, cruel, and seemingly invisible. He would study his victims for weeks, learning their routines before striking. He'd disable phone lines, wear a mask, and often spend hours inside his victims' homes, leaving police with few clues and a community paralysed with fear. For years, investigators chased this ghost, but he was always one step ahead. It turned out he was a former police officer himself, and he used his knowledge of law enforcement techniques to evade capture. Then, in 1986, the attack suddenly stopped. The trail went cold and the phantom vanished, leaving only pain and questions behind. The years stretched into decades. Case files grew thick with dead ends. For the survivors and the families of those murdered, time offered no comfort, just the gnawing ache of unanswered questions. The Golden State Killer, as writer Michelle McNamara eventually named him, became one of America's most infamous and elusive serial predators. Investigators like Paul Holes dedicated their career to the hunt, refusing to let the case die. But without a suspect, the DNA evidence from the crime scenes was like a key without a lock. It sat in storage, a silent testament to the killer's brutality, waiting for a technology that didn't even exist yet. Then, in the 2010s, a revolutionary new technique arrived: investigative genetic genealogy. The concept was both simple and brilliant. Investigators took the killer's DNA profile from a crime scene and uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, a resource used by everyday people to build their family trees. Suddenly, they got a hit. Not on the killer, but on a handful of his distant relatives, third and fourth cousins who had voluntarily shared their DNA online. From there, a team of genealogists and investigators began the painstaking process of building out a massive family tree. They went back generations, then moved forward, tracing every branch and descendant. It was a monumental task, but slowly they narrowed the possibilities, looking for a man of a certain age who lived in the right location at the times of the attacks. Finally, their focus zeroed in on one man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer and Navy veteran living a quiet life in a Sacramento suburb. He fit the profile. The timeline matched. Investigators began intense surveillance. They needed his DNA for a direct match to be absolutely certain. They trailed him, waiting for him to discard something, anything. After collecting DNA from a tissue in a trash can and a swab from his car door handle, they had what they needed. In the lab, the results were undeniable. It was a perfect match. The phantom who had terrorized California had a name and a face. In April 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested. The shockwave was immediate. This man, living a quiet suburban life, was responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in American history. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and dozens of uncharged rapes and was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. After more than 40 years, the silent witness of DNA had finally spoken, bringing justice to a generation of victims who had all but given up hope. On a spring day in May 1976, 25-year-old Karen Persifield went for a walk near a park in the coastal town of Aptos, California. She never returned. Her body was discovered later, her life cut short in a brutal act of violence. Investigators worked the scene, collecting forensic evidence and chasing down every possible lead. The investigation was thorough but frustrating. A person of interest was identified early on, a man named Richard Somerhalder, but there just wasn't enough evidence to charge him. With no definitive suspects, the case went cold. For Karen's family, including a 6-year-old daughter, a lifetime of questions began. They were left to wonder who had done this and why. The years turned into decades, and the case of Karen Percyfield faded from the headlines. Just another unsolved tragedy in the archives of the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office. For nearly 46 years, the case remained frozen in time. But in 2022, investigators took a fresh look, this time with tools that would have seemed like science fiction in 1976. They sent forensic evidence from the original crime scene to Othram, a private lab in Texas that specializes in solving the toughest cold cases. Othram's technique, called forensic-grade genome sequencing, is a game changer. While traditional DNA testing looks at about 20 genetic markers, Othram's process analyzes hundreds of thousands. This creates an incredibly detailed DNA profile, even from old, degraded, or contaminated evidence. This powerful profile allows their genealogists to perform expansive searches, detecting relatives up to 6 cousins and building out vast family trees that can pinpoint a suspect with astonishing accuracy. Using this technology, Othram's team built a comprehensive DNA profile of the unknown killer from the 1976 crime scene. Their genealogists got to work, and soon the new investigative leads all pointed back to one name: Richard Somerhalder, the very same man who had been a person of interest all those years ago. The tragic irony is that justice had almost caught up with Somerhalder before. Just a few months after Karen's murder, he was arrested and convicted for killing 2 other women in Santa Cruz County. In what can only be called a failure in the justice system, he served only 8.5 years before being paroled and leaving the state. By the time Othram's technology definitively identified him as Karen's killer, he had already died in 1994. While Richard Somerhalder will never stand trial for Karen Percyfield's murder, science provided the one thing her family had been denied for nearly half a century: an answer. The case was officially closed. For Karen's daughter, who had spent a lifetime haunted by the unknown, the truth finally brought a measure of peace and a bittersweet justice. It confirmed that even when a killer escapes the law, science can ensure their secrets don't stay buried with them. The Golden State Killer, the Peacock Murders, and the case of Karen Percyfield, 3 stories separated by time and geography, but united by a common thread: justice unearthed by science. They are a powerful reminder that in the world of true crime, the past is never truly gone. Thanks to the relentless work of investigators and the ever-evolving power of DNA, more cold cases are being solved every day, bringing closure to families and proving that no killer can outrun their own genetic blueprint. If you found these stories of justice served compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the cases where science has the final say. Thanks for watching.